Exactly, Marina. The Federation Council has granted President Vladimir Putin permission to use military forces abroad in Syria. And Putin's chief of staff says that the aim of the operation is to fight terrorism and the spread of Islamic State.
I have to inform you that the president of Syria addressed our government with the request to provide military aid. The measure is triggered only by the national interests of Russia. The number of Russian citizens and people from the former Soviet Union who unfortunately joined the terrorist organization Islamic State is growing. Some of them have already returned to the Russian territory, and you can easily imagine that they will continue to come back.
The official insisted there will be no Russian soldiers fighting on the ground in Syria. He says military aid will be restricted to the use of air force, and during a restricted period of time only. The Syrian army fighting on the ground will coordinate its efforts with Russian jets in the air.
Right, Medina, thanks very much indeed for this update. Medina Kochno there. Now, formally, President Vladimir Putin was granted permission to use force abroad, and it comes after Syrian President Bashar al-Assad requested military assistance in his war against Islamic State. Putin's chief of staff insisted there will be no Russian soldiers fighting on the ground in Syria, and he said military aid will be restricted to the use of the air force during a limited period of time. The Syrian army fighting on the ground will coordinate its efforts with Russian jets in the air. Well, in the studio with me now is artist William Whiteman, who is joining us to discuss this plan more in detail and the implications of this. So, what do we have at the moment is that Russia gears up to engage in Syria to help the government troops in their struggle against ISIL. But we already have the U.S.-led coalition there operating. Why does Russia think its campaign will be more effective?
Well, I mean, obviously you're going to have the combination of the Russian Air Force, which is what we know at the moment, just the Russian Air Force fighting on the ground with government troops. And, I mean, aside from the Kurdish militias in the north, the government troops, the Syrian Arab Army, are the most effective troops on the ground who are effective at fighting in the area. And this combination of the Air Force fighting with the government army is something which the U.S. coalition completely lacks.
And what about the international law? I mean, is this move rather in line with it?
Well, I mean, we've just heard the head of Putin's administration, Sergei Ivanov, saying that Russian military has been deployed at the request for military aid by President Assad. And that's the main difference between the Russian strategy and the US-led coalition's campaign, who are themselves very reluctant to coordinate with the Syrian government themselves. And, I mean, moreover, some governments have actually already backed the move. For example, the Iranian government has said that the campaign is absolutely legitimate.
Well, you know, while we were talking, of course, the situation is developing very quickly. And let me just bring this to our viewers here. It's news just in that we're getting from the Ministry of Defense here, and it says that the airplanes of the Russian Federation have started to conduct the air operation. So there we go. I mean, the situation is developing, is not just developing, but already starting there. And if not unexpected, I mean, the move by all means caught many by surprise. Tell us more about that.
Well, I mean, we've heard lots of rumors recently about Russia stepping up its support for Assad. You've had well, I mean, there's always been the continued support militarily of the Assad regime, but recently you've had the expansion of the airbase in Latakia, the arrival of some half a dozen or more T-90 Russian tanks, various MiGs, that sort of thing. And so the sending of more Russian aid, that is. And so Russia has been stepping up its involvement in Syria, also through establishing this Iraq-based military communication center, which is in coordination with Damascus, Tehran, and then Baghdad. So the timing is no coincidence then, of course. Just 2 days ago, Vladimir Putin grabbed everyone's attention at the UN General Assembly when he highlighted the extreme dangers that IS pose to the entire region.
Положение дел более чем опасно. Тем более, что в лагерях исламского государства проходят обкатку боевики из многих стран, в том числе из европейских, К сожалению, должен сказать об этом прямо, уважаемые коллеги, и Россия не является здесь исключением. Нельзя допустить, чтобы эти головорезы, которые уже почувствовали запах крови, потом вернулись к себе домой и там продолжили свое черное дело. Мы этого не хотим. Ведь этого никто не хочет, не так ли? Мы предлагаем руководствоваться не амбициями, создать по-настоящему широкую международную антитеррористическую коалицию, как и антигитлеровская коалиция.
Now, Russia insists that Syrian settlements should involve all sides, including Assad, an idea that was initially met with opposition from the West. But now there is a growing number of voices suggesting it may not be such a bad idea.
You can't continue to double down on a strategy that's doomed to failure.
You need to have conversations with people, and you need to find the common ground.
And now, a Middle East expert joins me live now for more on this. Thanks so much, Mr. Risk, for joining us here in the Theater National. Well, as we now know, Russia is ready to take action against ISIL. And in fact, the latest that we're getting from the ministry, from the Defense Ministry here, that Russia has already started air strikes on the ISIL positions. Well, what we have there at the moment in the region is the U.S. is already waging its own air campaign. So what do you make of this? I mean, should we expect joint efforts there at all?
I think that this step comes after it was proven, or it became clear, that the U.S. attempts to wage war on ISIL are either futile or unsuccessful, or either the U.S. is not honest in its fight against ISIL. Either way, it has become very clear that the so-called international coalition against ISIS has been unsuccessful in its efforts. On the contrary, ever since this campaign, this so-called campaign began, we've seen ISIL expand and expand even more. So I think that basically left no choice to the Russian President Vladimir Putin but to step up and assume this role, particularly because, as the speaker in the studio mentioned, and as has been mentioned by many, we have a large increase in the Russian fighters who had joined ISIS. The latest numbers speak refer to around 1,700 fighters, Russian fighters who were fighting with ISIS and have returned to Russia. We also have a large number of Turkmens, the Caucasus region, Uzbekistan. We even have now a significant presence of ISIS in Afghanistan, which is also not that far away from Russia. So if indeed Russia were to continue to just stand and watch, that would lead to an encirclement of Russia itself by these extremist groups. Therefore, it is only logical, and it is also urgent, for Russia to go ahead and act and take up this responsibility, because its own national security itself is at stake from these groups.
And how much of an impact do you think the Russian airstrikes will have on ISIL, given that, as you mentioned earlier, the coalition forces have already been there?
I think that a very important element, a very important differentiation we must make, what distinguishes the any Russian coalition from a Western coalition, is the fact that Russia has a clearer policy, a policy which is clear and direct, which is unambiguous. Russia believes, as we heard from the Russian president, that the Syrian military is fighting ISIS, and Russia has a clear ally on the ground in the army, the Syrian army itself, the forces of the Syrian government. So when you have such a clear alliance between a power like Russia and the government troops, the Syrian government troops on the ground, that makes it a lot more effective, contrary to the US or to the West, whose allies on the ground weren't very clear. We also heard about these US allies even failing. You know, the Islamic State or ISIL and Nusra, they were able to very swiftly defeat the so-called moderate rebels. The US policy appears to be a lot more confused, a lot more in tatters. Whereas when you have Russia, which clearly identifies its ally being the Syrian government, and there will be cooperation between Russia and government troops on the ground, indeed that will go a very long way in having a big effect on ISIS and in degrading and defeating this organization in the end.
Well, there are a lot of players there in the region, as we know. And, for example, the Iraqi foreign minister earlier told RT Arabic, our sister channel, that new countries joining the fight against ISIL is a positive thing, as he says. Let's now take a listen.
The more countries take part in the fight against terrorism, the better, especially if it's countries that have been affected by terrorism themselves. Terrorism is like fire. It spreads across borders. It's already spread from Syria to Iraq and can spread further. That's why it's important to consolidate the international effort against terrorism. We feel that we can't cooperate with states that support terrorism or prepares and finances fighters.
So as we can see, the latest reaction on Russia's move from Baghdad is also positive. However, it claims that the strikes should be conducted only within Syria. What do you make of this?
Well, the strikes conducted in Syria, I think that, in the end, the core problem does lie in Syria, because that's where the whole issue began. In Raqqa, we saw the establishment of this base, so-called base for ISIL. So to focus on Syria, I think, will go a long way in dislodging ISIS, especially if you cut off these logistical supply lines between the two sides. However, I also believe that the announcement of the intelligence sharing between Russia, Iran, Iraq and Syria, this new axis which we now see being formed, I think that this axis, or the efforts exerted by this axis, will also extend beyond Syria's borders to Iraq and elsewhere, maybe to other countries, and also have a huge impact. Again, what makes Russia, what distinguishes the Russian approach, that's something which we always, I think, must focus on. What distinguishes the Russian approach from the Western approach, in my view, is that the Russians appear to know what they want, appear to have a clear goal, and it is completely contrary to the Americans, who appear not to know what they want, who don't have clear allies. Russia was clear. It has an alliance with Iran, with Iraq. It's clear about who the enemy is. And if you compare that to the West, for example, we hear the West saying Assad is an enemy, and so is ISIL. That particular approach doesn't lead anywhere. It only brings about more confusion. That actually puts limits on how much can be done against these elements or against these terrorist groups. Whereas when we have a clear-cut approach when it comes to identifying who the real enemy is and who the real danger is, that, I think, will be much more effective. And so I think these Russian efforts, this intelligence sharing between Russia and regional countries, as I said, I think they will go a long way in defeating and inflicting serious damage on these groups. And I think that if you listen to what the Saudi foreign minister said, the Saudis are clearly fearful of this Russian announcement. We heard the Saudi foreign minister Adel al-Jubair yesterday saying that we might resort to the use of force to topple the Syrian president. I think that is a statement of desperation and a statement of fear because of the latest Russian steps in supporting the Syrian president and in dealing a severe blow to this terrorist group, which would in the end elevate and further empower the Syrian government and the Syrian president himself.
All right, Ali, thanks so much for talking to us. That was Ali Rizk, Middle East expert.